My name is Troy Wojtek, and I'm the Director of Ministry here at the Catholic Student Center. We are grateful to welcome you into our home. We call this place a home away from home for our students here at WashU. So welcome to our home. To our students who are here, welcome back home. We'll have some other students coming down because they're finishing up a happy hour upstairs. But a couple housekeeping things before I introduce Sam. If you're not familiar with the place, we have bathrooms down here. Women's are right there, men's are there in the corner. There's a water fountain back there. Help yourself to any food. Yeah. So Sam, I've known Sam now for about 2 months, maybe a month and a half. Yeah, Sam. We got introduced to Sam. He came by the Catholic Student Center, shared his story with Father Gary and myself, and immediately we were captivated and compelled by the story, and immediately we were like, this is a story that our community, I think, would love to hear. And as a person of faith, it made a lot of sense to invite Sam into our space, into our home, to share his story. I won't get into it too much because I'm going to let him talk about it, but we know that he'll say more about this, that his faith has a major role to play in his story about what he's going to share tonight. And so we're grateful for that. We're grateful for him to be here to share that aspect of his life. So Sam is an entrepreneur. He is an alum of WashU, actually. He earned a master's degree here. He is currently studying at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, earning a PhD there. He had a quest to visit every UN-recognized country in the world. He was in the midst of that quest. In 2019, he visited Syria. It was on the list, of course, and something happened he didn't expect. He was arrested, captured. Probably the exact words of that could change depending on how you think about it in Syria at the time. And he was wrongfully imprisoned, and that's his story. We're going to talk about that tonight. So we're grateful for him to be here. He is a St. Louis native, so also welcome back home, because obviously he's in the DC area studying. So thanks for joining us, and let's give a little round of applause for Sam. And I'm going to draw your attention to a short little video that we're going to start off with.
Good evening. This is our Western edition, and we begin with breaking news from overseas. A St. Louis man held since the spring by the Assad regime in war-torn Syria has been released and has been reunited with his parents. His name is Sam Goodwin, and his freedom tonight comes as the result of top-secret international negotiations involving a member of the Lebanese military. Don Daler leads us off tonight with new information, including what brought Goodwin to Syria.
I'm going to explain that a little bit. On June 14th, 2019, I made a promise to God that if he got me out of the situation I was in, I would never pass up an invitation to share the story with others. So it's a privilege to be here and share a little bit of my story with all of you this evening. My name's Sam Goodwin. I'm originally from and grew up here in St. Louis. From here, I went to undergrad in upstate New York at Niagara University. I played hockey there, which is what brought me up that way. And when I graduated in 2012, I took my first professional job in Singapore. And I planned to only be in Singapore for about 3 months, but I ended up staying for 6 years. And it was a fantastic opportunity, a great way to begin my professional career. I was working for a tech startup business in a regional NGO that was doing development work around Southeast Asia. Throughout this time, I traveled as much as I could. I was in the heart of Southeast Asia, had the world's best airport in my backyard, had a little bit of flexibility in my work schedule, and I took advantage of the opportunity to explore as much of the region and beyond as possible. Just a personal preference, I didn't like to repeat places. So even if I went somewhere and had a great experience, the next weekend, the next holiday, the next opportunity I had, I would just go somewhere different. So I put this formula into play for about 6 years, and in early 2018, I realized that I had traveled to 120 countries in the world. And it was at this point when I remember thinking, so how many are there? I always traveled because it was fun and I enjoyed it, but most importantly, I learned from it. Travel is the best education I've ever had. It was never about ticking boxes or checking places off a list. But I started doing some research. I learned that there are 193 fully recognized UN sovereign states. So I thought to myself, well, maybe I could go to all of them. So I started doing some more research, looking at some more things. I started with a map, my bank account, people who I knew in different places who might be able to help, visas that I might need. And ultimately, I decided that I was going to give this a shot. I had no idea if I could do it. I might fail miserably. I didn't even know what that would look like, but I became committed to working toward achieving something that I thought was extraordinary. So I prioritized it. A year later, in the spring of 2019, I had traveled to 180 of 193 countries in the world. And it was at this point when the next place that I was going to travel to was Syria, a country that's experiencing arguably the most tragic humanitarian disaster of our lifetime. By conservative estimates, 1 million people have died in the conflict. The UN stopped counting at 500,000. But one of the most significant things that I had learned through my travels was that places that are negatively perceived or that Western media tells us we're not supposed to like, those were the places where I had many of my best experiences and where my perspectives were most meaningfully impacted. So despite everything happening, I was confident that the same would be the case. One of the most compelling things for me about Syria specifically was its religious significance. It's the cradle of civilization. It's mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. Mary Magdalene was of Syrian descent. King David conquered northern Syria. Paul the Apostle's conversion took place on the road, of course, to Damascus, and we celebrated his feast day last week. My faith was a big part of my travel journey. I've been to Mass in 65 countries. I've visited Catholic churches in 115. In fact, the reason that I chose to enter Syria on a Saturday was so that I could attend Mass there the following morning. Little did I know, God had other ideas. And I didn't make it to Mass that Sunday, or any of the next 9 Sundays. On May 25th, 2019, I entered the northeast region of Syria. I went to a town called Qamishli, which is the largest town in the region. And just 2 hours after arriving, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. 2 armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. Thankfully, they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. I was desperately trying to understand what was happening. These men were loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. They had learned of my entry into the country and said that they were immediately raising all kinds of skepticism around my travel motives. As we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle accused me of espionage, of being an American spy, and collaborating with terrorists. nothing like this had ever happened to me before. The truck drove for about 5 minutes, and then it stopped. Then the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a blindfold, and he put it over my eyes. The van drove for about 1 minute. It stopped. I stepped out. They took the blindfold off. I looked up, and I was underneath a massive Syrian military airplane out on the tarmac of an airport. They handcuffed me behind my back, took me over to the ladder, and threw me into the cargo hold of the plane. About 30 minutes later, the plane took off. Here's a question for all of you. How often have you been flying on an airplane and not known where the plane is going? That was the situation I found myself in, and this incredible cloud of uncertainty was growing around me. About 90 minutes later, the plane landed in what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city. I was taken from the airport, driven into the center of town, and taken into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's Military Intelligence Prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. The officer in charge, he spoke a little bit of English. He escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door and he said, "Food, water, toilet, knock. Otherwise, quiet, no talking." And he slammed the door and left. I was stunned and in disbelief about what had happened in just a few short hours. My life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. I felt exactly the way they wanted me to. Hopeless, utterly cut off from any control of my life. There's a well-known American journalist named Hunter Thompson. He wrote a quote that said, "The edge. There's no honest way to explain it, because the only people who really know where it is are the ones who have gone over." When that cell door slammed shut, in that moment, I felt like I had gone over the edge. Thankfully, the cell wasn't too small. I could walk around just a little bit, but it had no window. It was all concrete. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. I remained here in solitary confinement for 27 days. The only human interaction I had was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water. Throughout this time, I was never physically harmed, but the facility was not soundproof. And every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells screaming from being beaten and tortured. Of course, I couldn't help but wonder, when's my turn? I realized that I was in an environment where nothing was off limits. I never stopped caring about dying or the long list of other bad things that I thought might happen to me, but I began to lose the energy to be afraid. Normal or average prisoners spend their time counting down the days to the end of their sentence, but hostages count up. Throughout this time, I found strength in several ways. I leaned on perspectives that I had developed from traveling to different corners of the world, which provoked gratitude for the basic food and water I was being given. I've encountered a lot of people around the world who don't have access to those things. I leaned on skills and traits that I developed from being a competitive athlete. The mental toughness, critical thinking, resilience. How often have we had a coach or a boss tell us, control what you can control? I leaned on a belief that I had a purpose in life and a desire to see family and friends again. But most importantly, I leaned on my faith. My prayers were what most meaningfully forced the uncertainty to lose its grip. My prayers became an uninterrupted conversation with God. I was constantly talking to him, pacing back and forth, kind of like I'm doing right now, saying things out loud. I said, God, I'm here. I'm listening. What are you trying to tell me today? What can I learn today? What are the positives about my situation today? My number one prayer was always, God, please keep my situation safe and peaceful. Please keep me physically unharmed. My second prayer was then about the timeline. And this was the prayer that for me became the most tricky and intense. If this was all going to end peacefully, then the next question was when? And I remember almost positioning this as like a business deal. I said, God, I know you have a plan, but is it possible? Would you consider an adjustment to the timeline? Can that work with your plan? The third thing I did was I finished all of my prayers by saying the rosary. And I have to admit that due to the stress of the situation and solitary confinement, I couldn't always remember the exact mysteries. And sometimes my rosaries just became 50 Hail Marys. But I dedicated each decade to something different. I prayed for my family. I prayed for anybody who I thought might be helping to get me out of this situation. And some of those people are in this room. I prayed for world peace. I prayed very hard for the courage to forgive my captors. Through that, I discovered that I was working to forgive people who weren't even sorry. And that's strength. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. Thanks to the strength that was generated through these prayers, I made it to day 27. And it was at this point when I was taken out of solitary confinement, driven across town, reassigned to a federal prison on the outskirts of the city, a place called Adra, and I was put in a cell with about 40 other men. And I remained here for the next 35 days. During this time, I was also put on trial in Damascus. I went to court 4 times. In all 4 sessions, the judge denied me a lawyer, denied me a translator, continued to characterize me as a spy and a terrorist without providing any meaningful information about what might happen to me. This trial was taking place inside an ideological vacuum and was not going to be impacted by anything I said or did. But back at Adra, the other inmates became friends. We cooked and shared food together. They taught me Arabic. I taught them English. There was a prison basketball court. I taught several of them how to play knockout. One of them even smuggled a note out of the prison, a note that successfully navigated a game of geopolitical telephone and made it to my father here in St. Louis, and served as the first time I managed to communicate that I was alive. These men truly risked their life to help save mine and were a remarkable display of humanity. I learned very quickly that virtually none of them were true criminals. They were just victims of a corrupt system and had been caught up in the instability of the conflict. They reinforced some of the most important things that I had learned through my travels. For example, never judge people by the actions of their government. People who have the least often give the most. It's something that's true in all corners of the world. I've learned that every person's why is the same. We all eat, sleep, breathe, want to be happy, or chasing some kind of goal. It's only the how that changes. Although being here at Adra was unquestionably an upgrade from solitary confinement, I had reached the 2-month mark of being held captive as a political prisoner in the Middle East. And this incredible cloud of uncertainty was continuing to grow around me. On July 26th, 2019, one of the prison officials came to the cell I was in. He called my name, and he indicated that I was being moved. As he escorted me to the front of the prison, he stopped and he said, "Sam, you're very lucky. President Assad has agreed to release you." This sounds encouraging, but I have been lied to so many times in the past 2 months that I'd essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But outside, I stepped into a black SUV, which turned out to be part of a 5-vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. We didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic. We drove west towards the mountains. Nobody in the vehicle said a word. The nice cars, the professional nature of the operation made me think that this was either really good or really bad. I'm about to experience one extreme of the captivity spectrum here, but I don't know which one it is. We came up to a checkpoint, one that seemed to be some kind of significant border. And as we passed through, the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he tapped me on the leg and he said, "Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now." This was encouraging, but I still wasn't quite sure about everything that was happening. But from there, we drove for another hour into the city of Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. And I was taken to the Office of Lebanese Internal Security, kind of like the equivalent of the FBI here in the US. And when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military intelligence officials and media reporters, my parents were there, culminating this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and a breathtaking display of God answering prayers. I had the opportunity to meet and thank General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security. He had mediated my release with the Syrians. And that evening, my parents and I went to the town of Byblos in Lebanon, and we prayed together at St. Charbel Monastery. St. Charbel was a 19th century Lebanese monk, well known for working miracles, and whose feast day was just one day earlier, on the same day that my release was granted. The next day, as we made our way back to the US and here to St. Louis, I learned that General Ibrahim's negotiations had led to President Assad in Syria finally figuring out what had happened and dropping his bogus charges against me. I became and remain the only American civilian that he's ever released. Since being home, I've been fortunate to be surrounded by an overwhelmingly purposeful support system, one that's included everything from terrific family and friends to visiting the Oval Office. I've been learning to survive survival, which has included a range of things from managing occasional episodes of PTSD to early on some kind of interesting conversations with my bank, convincing them that being held hostage in a foreign country is grounds for them to forgive credit card late fees. Despite everything that had happened, my original curiosity about the world had really never been stronger. When I first came home, my family pretty much shackled me to the kitchen table and wanted to throw away my passport, never let me go anywhere again. But that eased, and at the end of 2019, I set out to complete my travel goal. I was very committed to not letting what happened conquer me. On December 31st, 2019, I made one final trip, and it was actually to a nation that is home to more Catholics than any other in the world. It was Brazil. And with that trip, I had traveled to every country in the world, joining a group of only about 100 people who have ever done that. It's a little bit interesting. There are a lot of people who hear this story, my story, and say, this guy is an idiot and never should have tried to go to every country, never should have been in Syria in the first place. There are a lot of other people who hear my story and say, this guy is a hero for surviving. The truth is, I'm neither of those extremes. I became part of an extraordinary circumstance and just did my best to embrace and manage it. What I've learned to be true is that we can't always choose the exact path that we take in life, but we can always choose the way in which we walk it. I sometimes will end my presentation here, but when I do, and if I have a Q&A, one of the first questions I always get is, so, Sam, how exactly did you get out? Much of what I've told you so far this evening has been the story of one man in a cell. But in truth, there was something much bigger happening. It was God's story. I was Assad's hostage, but only until God accomplished what he intended to through my captivity. Let me tell you just a little bit about what I mean by that. The news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in a little bit more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria for a few days. When that time passed and nobody was hearing from me, they began to worry. My father works in civil engineering. My mother is a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective fields, but they're an average family from St. Louis. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act. They reached the FBI field office here in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated some of the highest levels of the U.S. government in Washington. But throughout my captivity, my family had kind of a roller coaster experience with the U.S. government. But early on, the government communicated two key things to my family. First, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news. Don't let the press get a hold of this. Keep the communication very tight, because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. The second thing they said was, you should really manage your expectations. We have no diplomatic or economic ties with Syria. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. 3 weeks later, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville, she particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening, and she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them to blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the US government of keeping all of the communication very tight. So she decides that she's going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies. And as the story goes, hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, honestly, things aren't very good. She goes on to explain, my brother has been missing in Syria for 3 weeks. Nobody's heard from him. Working with all these government, military, intelligence officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. Roommate Steph is, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things, offers her full support, and at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my Steph responds almost jokingly or sarcastically. She says, honestly, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray. And roommate Steph says, wait, let me call you back. It turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese. And her uncle is good friends with General Abbas Ibrahim. General Ibrahim has a somewhat secret back channel relationship with the Syrians and was able to mediate my release when so many others were struggling to do anything. When my sister called her college roommate, she didn't really even know that she was Lebanese. She didn't know Lebanon was close to Syria. She couldn't find Lebanon on a map. It wasn't strategic. She was just calling a friend at a time when she desperately needed support. And I can tell all of you here this evening, I believe that if in that moment she would have decided to just call a different friend, I might not be here. So the FBI, the CIA, President Trump, the Pentagon, Pope Francis was involved, Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies, were all struggling to be effective. But my sister's college roommate could identify a path to get an American hostage released from Syria. So what do all of us here this evening do with a story like this? What's the message? Once I wrap up, I'm happy to have Q&A, answer any questions if there are any, but what's the message? There's still a lot of disorientation for me today around the questions of why and what was the purpose of all this. And sometimes I feel like God was using prison to bring me closer to him. And if that's the case, sometimes I feel like I wish he would have chosen a different method. But what I think one of the things I was most profoundly reminded of through this is that regardless of our situations or circumstances or where we come from, God meets us where we are and takes us where he wants us to go. I was being held captive amidst a brutal civil war where war crimes and crimes against humanity were running rampant. The most connected, influential people in the world were working on it, struggling to do anything. And the result that they were all working towards had never happened before. It doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? But when God was ready to solve this problem, he did so very quickly and very simply with a phone call between two 25-year-old girls who used to be college roommates. How does that happen? Because it's God's story. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. It doesn't have to be questions, but I'm happy to answer any.
Dan,
Yeah.
when you were arrested, what did you have on you? Your passport, a backpack, your clothes? Yeah, what did you have?
So she asked when I was arrested, what did I have on me? And the only things I had on me were my phone, my wallet, and my passport. And they took those very quickly, and I was cut off. I was cut off completely. So that's all I had. I had a backpack that was back at the hotel that I was staying at, which actually made its way back to my family through kind of a circuitous route, and it's actually right here. That's actually the backpack. But I only had those 3 things, and it was taken. Yeah. There was, yeah.
Sam, when you first got picked up and taken to wherever, did they then question you? Were you allowed to tell your story? Did they believe any of it, or how did the process go?
Yeah. When I was originally detained, they took me to a facility nearby and did ask me quite a few questions. There were a number of challenges that I had in that situation, though. One was a language barrier. There was very little English being spoken, and I don't speak any Arabic. The other thing that was challenging was that I will admit that my story, the truth, was actually a little bit weird, because I tried to tell them I am here because I'm traveling to every country, and that just didn't compute, and they refused to believe that. And you know, it got to a point later on where I literally said in an interrogation I was handcuffed, blindfolded, in a very uncomfortable situation, and at one point I literally said to them, "Go look at my Instagram," because there are pictures of trying and show what I was doing. So they did ask me questions, but it seemed as though I was on a predetermined track, given where I was or who I was or whatever it might have been, the stamps in my passport, whatever it might have been, and went down that path. Yeah.
Were there any days that you faith was weakened, or you felt, saying I wasn't listening?
So he asked, were there any days where my faith was weakened? And I would say that I rode a bit of a roller coaster on that front. You know, I was in a situation where everything had been taken from me. My material possessions, my communication, my freedom. But it was at that point when I knew that my faith was absolute and they could not take that from me. And that's what I leaned on when I had nothing else. And I think that a big reason that I was able to do that was because it was something that I had worked on my whole life, thanks to my mother, my family, the people around me. And without that, I'm not sure what I would have had, because that's what I turned to. I would have been in a completely different situation without that. And I found that if I wouldn't have worked on it my entire life, it wouldn't have been there when I needed it most, in my experience. Thanks. Yeah.
So without the conversation from the roommate, prior to that, no one knew where you were. There was no communication with the U.S. government, with anybody, right?
So she asked, prior to the communication from the Stephanies, nobody knew where I was. And there were other paths being explored by my family and others, so there was some information out there, but that proved to be the most reliable information. And you know, one of the most overwhelming things for me since being released and in the wake of this has been learning about everything that happened on the outside while I was trapped on the inside, because I knew nothing about that. And I'll never forget, a few minutes after we reunited in Beirut, I was thinking about everything that had happened in the past 9 weeks, and I said to my parents in that office, I said, I have a story for you. And my parents looked at each other and looked back at me, and my mom said, well, Sam, we have a story for you too. And that was a very kind of dramatic comment, because I didn't know about anything that had happened. And in the past few years, I've learned that what happened on the outside is arguably more extraordinary than what happened to me. And it's been kind of overwhelming. I've found that 3.5 years later, I'm still learning about things that happened, and I'm still saying thank you to people, because I'm learning about someone who made a phone call or said a prayer. People even came up to me tonight and said, I was with your mom when that happened, or whatever it might be. And I'm still 3.5 years later learning about these things. So it's really been overwhelming, and so much of that for me just comes back to gratitude and putting things into perspective and feeling so grateful that things ended the way they did, because these types of situations don't always end that way. So I went on a bit of a tangent there, but thank you. Yeah.
So I'm curious about a note. Like, how you got, I mean, did you have access to pencils, number one, and paper? And then how in the world were you able to get a note out of a prison back to the U.S.?
So she asked about the note, basically the details around the note. Here's the story. It was about 2 weeks into the second month. So at this point, it had been a total of 6 weeks since I had gone missing. What I wanted more than anything was communication. I was starving for communication. The other inmates around me were becoming friends, and I was getting to know them, and some of them spoke English, and we were developing these relationships. One of them came to me and said, "Sam, I can get a note out of this prison for you." And of course, he volunteered that, which he had my attention right away. I was very interested in this. And he explained to me, this was on a Friday, he explained to me that on Saturday, the next day, it was visitor day at the prison, and he had a friend coming who was going to bring clean laundry, and he was going to give his friend dirty laundry, and he explained to me that he could smuggle the note in his dirty laundry out of the prison. Let's go, let's do it. So we had at Audra in the second month, we had pens and paper, we had some of that stuff. So I wrote this note, and I put my dad's name and his phone number, and then I wrote a couple lines. I'm safe, but I'm in Audra prison, I need consular help, and I gave it back to him. And I'll never forget, he looked at it and he said, "Sam, you should put a clue on the note so that if it makes it to your family, they'll know that it came from you." And I remember thinking, like, gosh, that's a great idea. I've never been in this situation before, but that's a great idea. So I didn't have much time because of the way we were being moved around, but I wrote a clue at the bottom of the note to basically authenticate it if it made it to my family. And I actually have a picture of the note here that I can show you, and you can read it. So after my buddy recommended that I write a clue, I wasn't quite sure what to write, and I didn't have a lot of time, but this was the first thing that came to mind. My family has gone to the MAC, and I ordered the salmon, and I just wrote it real quickly and gave it back to him. It turns out that a couple days later, that note had gone out to my friend's friend. He had called someone in the US who had then called my father and sent a picture of it. And it turned out to serve as proof of life. But what was maybe the most significant was the clue. And my parents at that point, basically, they had the FBI on speed dial at this time, and they called and said, "We know that Sam is alive," or at least he was when this was written, because he does order the salmon at the Missouri Athletic Club. So, and then like a year and a half later, that picture of the note ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and I couldn't have ever imagined when I was writing it that it would have ended up in that situation. But it's kind of a lesson in just humanity. These people really risked their life to help save mine. And were a really remarkable display of humanity. And there was even talk that like the MAC was gonna like rename their salmon like Sam. It's like, our salmon's so good it frees hostages or something. I don't know what the exact marketing pitch was, but yeah. So yeah.
Nobody visits 193 countries without a lot of curiosity. How did your curiosity show up as a grade school student, as a high school student, as a college student?
Yeah. So he essentially asked about curiosity. Where did the curiosity come from? So I am from St. Louis. I went to St. Clement grade school in Des Peres, and then went to high school at De Smet. I was class of '07. And I do remember in 3rd grade, I made it to the championship round of my class's geography bee. And I remember the final question was, what is the only Portuguese-speaking country on the continent of South America? And I thought about it, and it was actually Brazil. And I answered it correctly, and I won. And I think I got like 2 nights homework pass or something like that, which was a big deal at the time. But I think a lot of it kind of started early. I had a globe in my room and started, but I believe that curiosity is the most consistent source of innovation and worldly contributions. I think, frankly, that the world belongs to the curious, and that's where all of this, so many things that I've done in the past, 10 or 15 years have been rooted in curiosity and really just hoping to better understand the world and understand people. So I think some of it started when I was a kid and then just kind of grew. I had an opportunity in Singapore and things kind of grew from there. But I agree with you that so much of this is rooted in curiosity. Yeah.
If you're around, we'll talk about how your faith was and how your faith was stretched, or how did you hold on during that time? Your test of faith.
Well.
There is a microphone, I think. Is there a?
Well, there's people.
Sorry, Troy, I don't want to.
So the not talking for me was really a challenge. So up in the front, I have Sue Wicks that went to Mass with me every single day. She works at the registrar at Rosati Kane. Her job is not to keep me sane, but that became in her job description, which was quite challenging. Teresa is right there. She teaches theology at Rosati Kane, and she was there. This entire row, Andrea, Julie, Tara, and wherever Jean went, we were in the middle of an Acts retreat when Sam was taken, and I more or less fell apart. And Julie prayed with me on the bed one. We're bedrooms, right? She prayed, and then Tara and Andrea and Jean were we were just praying constantly and sending me texts. Santa, you yourself I had a lot of support for, as a prayer scene. Sam was 30 at the time, and my prayer would be, just out of habit, is always to start with gratitude. And I would say, thank you so much for giving me Sam for 30 years. He's just been a wonderful son. I'm just so grateful. Sure would like to have him. Like when you get down to the supplication, for those of you who are very Ignatian, you start with thank you, and then you eventually get down to, I truly believe this was a miracle. I've prayed for miracles before. My mom died at a young age, and I begged God, please do a miracle. And the way I saw a miracle would be her restoring life, and that didn't happen. I also had a best friend. I begged God. So I see miracles all the time. I work in a hospital, and I would just see all these miracles, and I wanted one. And I don't know why God gave me this miracle, but I know that it was, in fact, a miracle. And I don't know why God sometimes tells us no, but some of you who are around, like Sue can tell you, I was one happy girl in that picture up there, and you can tell, like, I'm just strung out. We'd been on, we'd been on 2 or 3 different planes. For 2 days, I was jet lagged. I didn't care. I didn't care how much media was there taking pictures of us. I was just holding on to Sam, and they were gonna have a hard time getting him away from me. So, yeah, thank you, sorry.
Sam,
Yeah, sure.
you know, I talked to you just for a moment, I'm a huge fan of your mother.
Me too.
We taught next door to each other, but I want to just say something about God and the way God works. We've all been taught different things, but my mother always taught me, even preschool, and I believed it. If God speaks to us in nudges, inklings, intuition, words, of course, through people, places, and things, of course, but in your story, Stephanie, she knew she wasn't supposed to call anybody. She knew she wasn't supposed to speak. Something in her being, in her energy, through grace, through the energy of God, I call that the Holy Spirit. She picked up the phone and called the other Stephanie. Okay. I just think we all need, you remind me, Sam, of the way I need to pay more attention to my inklings, my nudges, people who flow through my mind. Pick up the phone and call them. I mean, I really, Sam, I also am sitting here, well now I'm standing, but thinking of all the saints, the stories of saints thrown into prison. Just to recap, they didn't go home to mom. You know, we know their stories, and that's how we know them, because they're saints and martyrs. But I just think your whole story is a reminder how God works in our lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
You had said that you were the only person who was held under the circumstances you were held under to be released, but there are other people still held captive, and do you have any sort of survivors type guilt related to maybe other Americans still being there, or your friends in the second prison still being there?
Yeah, so I am the only American civilian to be released by the Syrian regime. There are others who have been taken hostage in Syria and have been released. Maybe they were held by ISIS or al-Nusra or some other non-state actor. There are believed to be at least 2 other Americans who are being held by the Syrian regime, by the Syrian government right now. On a little bit more broader level, there are right now 59 public cases of Americans who are being held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. Every one of these families is going through the hardest thing they've ever gone through in their life and are fighting a battle that nothing could have prepared them for. So after coming home, I found myself in this space, and I don't know if it was survivor's guilt, but more of survivor's responsibility almost. And I wanted to get involved and try and do what I could to help these other families, or have my family help their families, whether it was in Syria or in other places. Many of these people are being held in the countries that you would think. So try and do what I can to help. And so I found myself in this community. I worked for a year for the Foley Foundation, which is named after Jim Foley, who was a journalist who was executed by ISIS, and that organization has kind of grown into the authority on these issues. So I've gotten involved in a few different ways, I felt very much a responsibility, because I learned quickly that this isn't often how some of these cases end. So I really felt a need to do what I could to help, and still trying to do that.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Do you feel your trip to Syria completed, or are you still?
You go back? Would I go back? So I have kind of a complicated relationship with Syria. One of the challenges that I have with my story, actually, seriously, one of the challenges that I have is that is the way that I portray the country of Syria. I can tell you like I can tell you so clearly that some of the best hospitality that I've ever experienced in the world has been in the Middle East, across the Arab world. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but if you experience the food, the hospitality, the way that they take care of their visitors, it's an incredible region of the world, and unfortunately there are small subsets of people that give a larger subset a bad rep. And so one of the challenges I have is how I portray the country. This is a country that's not used to war. Before the Arab Spring came in 2011, in 2010, Syria welcomed 9 million travelers from around the world. It's one of the most culturally and religiously significant places in the world, and it's heartbreaking what's happened over the past 11 years. And I know that if I wouldn't have had the situation that I had, and that's my story, that's my experience, and that's what I talk about, but I know that if I wouldn't have had that experience, I would have had a fantastic experience with the people, understanding them, learning about their culture, their religion, everything that they do. So I have as I did everywhere else in that region. So I have a challenge sometimes by kind of communicating and portraying them negatively like this, because I know that there's so much positivity around it, and unfortunately, I had the experience that I did. So to kind of answer your question, like I'm not planning to go back right now, but actually I would genuinely love that opportunity at some point, because it's a really incredible place that is widely misunderstood, particularly in the West, and particularly I think in the past 11 years. So maybe at some point that will make sense, but not not right now. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your stories.
Yeah, of course.
And kind of in line with the last question, my friend Austin Smith told me that of all of the countries that you visited, if you name one, that you could tell us a story from it. So maybe like.
Oh yeah. He might have been referencing a video that I recently made. It was just a fun video where I just told something about every country. But I can, yeah. yeah.
How about like Kuwait?
Kuwait. So the Kuwaiti dinar is the world's highest valued currency. So one dinar is $4 US, which is a bit counterintuitive because normally it goes the other way. So that was one of my big takeaways from Kuwait. I played hockey in Kuwait. I played with their national hockey team actually a couple of years ago. Yeah. You want to name another one? Sorry. Yeah, Troy.
Sam, what did you learn about yourself? I mean, you were pushed to the brink, and you talked about some of the things that might have been tools to help you get through that. But yeah, what did you learn about yourself in terms of how you could get through something like that, and where the demons surfaced in the midst of it, and stuff.
Yeah.
And how that plays out in your life now.
Yeah. So I think that if we're honest with ourselves, we will say that our personality today, the very essence of our life, is a result of the challenges we've faced and the choices we've made as a result of those challenges, not because of the good times that we've had. One of the biggest things that I think about in response to Troy's question is the way that I manage and look at challenges, regardless of how big or small they are, and taking what's in front of me and putting it into perspective really helps me deal with it. And I think that having an experience like this, being pushed to the brink, really helps me put things into perspective. It could be something as small as being stuck in traffic. I sometimes am stuck in traffic and I get annoyed and then think, well, it could be worse. Things could be worse type thing. And again, it's a dramatic example, but just by taking our lowest point and putting things into perspective, I think the way that I deal and embrace with challenges is one of my biggest takeaways from this. Father Gary.
Sam, I think you're aware, really, that these are uncertain times. And you use that word
one of the biggest ways that I've come to embrace and manage uncertainty, one of the first things I always do is try to channel gratitude. I think this is where everything begins. This is what grounds us. The problem or the challenge that I think a lot of us have with gratitude is that we lack perspective. And I'm trying to get people to practice reframing their perspective, especially when facing uncertainty. I mean, there are a billion people in the world who don't have access to clean water, and people are complaining that their Instagram's not growing. I mean, give me a break. The fact that each of us are able to just physically be in this room tonight means we have an infinite number of things to be grateful for. I mean, when I wake up in the morning and everyone in my family is alive and healthy, my day starts off great. So I think that being content and grateful for what you have and not envious for what you don't have while still being ambitious is a different way to think about being satisfied. And that is one of the first steps that I take when managing uncertainty is to put everything into perspective, and I think gratitude really grounds us to start embracing those uncertain times. Thank you. Yeah, one more, I guess. Yeah.
So I have a question. I've had desire to travel, and I have a tiny, tiny bit, but I have a husband and 4 children, and so how do you take that desire to travel, right? Would love to go. I've been to 4 countries so far. 192 is a long way away. But even just getting to 10 would be awesome.
Of course.
Number 5. But how do you do that, like, in a reasonable, like, it's called the balance of, like, economics of having to pay for it, right? And also experience it. How would you recommend, right, exploring the world on a shoestring?
So I recognize that. So I'm not married, I don't have kids, so I recognize in a little bit different situation. One of the things that I would say is that travel doesn't have to be expensive. It's oftentimes, if we're kind of responsible, it's not as expensive as some people think. And maybe one of the suggestions that I often find myself saying to people is to just go, because it ends up maybe not being as kind of like overbearing as you might think. But again, I recognize that people, you have different kind of variables and different things to consider. So I would love to try and help any way I could, and so let me know if I could help with anything. But I hope that you're able to. It's been the best education that I've ever had, and I could go on and on about why I think it's fantastic. So I hope that you are able to, and I'm happy to do anything I can to help. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a thought. So there's an organization called Trusted House Sitters. So go to trustedhousesitters.com, and if you can travel to lots of places in the country and in the world, and you're staying in people's homes and taking care of their pets. You can also sign yourself up for here, where people stay in your home and take care of your pets while you travel to other places, and there's no charge for that. There's a one-time setup fee for the organization, but you're staying in people's homes for free in exchange for walking their dog or feeding their cat or whatever. So.
Great.
Thanks, Sam.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.